The cold came early that morning, sharper than a knife honed on stone. Frost clung to the brittle grass, and every exhale from Silas Ward's mouth rolled into the dim air like pale smoke. The kind of cold that felt personal, as if it had singled you out and meant to test you before the sun even cleared the hills. He'd been up since before first light, walking the northern fence line with a coil of wire in one hand and his hammer swinging against his hip. Boots crunched on frozen earth, the sound loud in the stillness. Not even the meadowlarks were stirring yet. Out in the far pasture, his cattle stood huddled together, steam rising from their backs like breath from some slumbering beast. By the time he turned toward home, the eastern sky was a faint smear of silver behind a bank of pale clouds. The valley lay quiet beneath it, his ranch house and outbuildings etched in the low light like they'd been carved out of the land itself. He'd built them with his own hands 15 years ago. Every beam, every board, placed with the same careful attention he gave to shoeing a horse or mending a fence. As he crossed the yard, the kitchen window caught his eye. A thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney, but it wasn't the promise of coffee that made him slow his stride. There was movement inside, someone moving strangely, like each step carried a cost. Mercy Whitmore. She was young, maybe 20, with a tiredness about her eyes that didn't belong on someone that age. She'd shown up 3 months back, hat in hand, looking for work. He'd needed help in the house, and she'd needed a roof over her head. That was all the arrangement required. She kept to herself, spoke little, and did her job well. Silas respected that. People who talked less often had more worth listening to when they finally did open their mouths. But this morning, something was wrong. Through the frost-streaked glass, he saw her favoring her left side, her right leg dragging just enough to catch the eye. Every few steps she paused, steadying herself against the table or the back of a chair. Her face was pale, jaw tight, as if she were swallowing pain with every breath. She bent to pick up a spoon she'd dropped, lowering herself in careful increments, her back stiff, her movements slow. Silas's boots were still on the porch when he stopped watching and pushed the door open. The hinges complained softly, a familiar sound. But Mercy still flinched, as if the noise had been a gunshot. She straightened quickly, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the move not quite hiding the way her hand trembled. "Morning, Mr. Ward. Coffee's almost ready." Her voice carried a brightness that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of brittle cheer he'd heard from animals caught in a trap but pretending to be fine. Silas hung his hat on the peg by the door, watching her without making it obvious. The way she gripped the counter, the slight tremor in her fingers as she reached for the cups. All of it was wrong. He'd spent his life reading the land, the weather, the unspoken signs in a horse's stance. This was the same. Something was hurt here. He stepped to the table, letting his gloves fall onto the wood. "Mercy," he said quietly. She froze for half a breath, hands stilling on the coffee pot. "Yes, sir." "You're hurt." Not a question, a statement. The room went still, save for the soft tick of the clock and the whisper of her breathing. Outside, a meadowlark called, its song sharp in the morning air. Mercy kept her back to him for a long moment before finally turning. That's when he saw it. Her lip was split on the left side, the cut fresh enough that it still held a thin, dark line of blood beneath the scab. A bruise spread across her cheekbone, yellowing at the edges, partly hidden by the curtain of her hair. But it was her eyes that tightened his chest. Eyes dulled by the resignation of someone who no longer believed things could get better. "I fell," she said quickly, the words tumbling out too fast. Clumsy of me. Tripped coming down the stairs last night." Silas set his coffee cup down with deliberate care. There were no stairs in the cabin where she stayed. He'd built it himself. One step up to the door and flat inside. The lie hung between them like wood smoke, bitter and obvious. "Show me these stairs," he said. She blinked, thrown off balance. "Sir, the stairs you fell down. I'd like to see them." Her mouth opened, then closed again. The truth was a stone too heavy to lift. She straightened, pulling her shoulders back in a way that might have looked defiant if it weren't for the pain shadowing the movement. "I should get back to work." She turned away, limping slightly as she crossed toward the pantry. Silas watched her go, the frost still clinging to his boots, the cold from outside somehow finding its way into his chest. Whoever had done this to her hadn't done it for the first time. He could see it in the practiced way she hid the limp, in the care she took not to move too much. This was someone used to covering bruises, and it wasn't going to stop on its own. He stood there a long while, after she disappeared into the pantry, listening to the faint clink of cups and the rustle of her apron. His hand flexed unconsciously, fingers curling into a fist. Out the window, the barn loomed, the frost on its roof catching what little light the weak sun offered. He'd left it unlocked last night, a rare lapse, figuring nothing in it was worth stealing. But as he looked out over the yard, a slow, unwelcome thought took root. Leaving something unguarded had a way of inviting trouble. He just hadn't realized the trouble might come wearing a badge. Somewhere beyond the valley, the wind shifted, carrying the distant sound of a single hoofbeat. Faint, but enough to turn his gaze toward the horizon. A rider was coming, and from the way the figure moved in the saddle, Silas already knew who it was. The rider crested the low ridge to the east, a dark shape against the pale morning sky. Even at this distance, Silas could pick out the slouched posture and lazy sway in the saddle. A man who rode like he owned whatever his horse's hooves touched. Deputy Vernon Briggs. The badge he wore had the shine of authority, but to Silas it was nothing more than a glinting excuse for cruelty. Briggs was the kind of man who liked the power more than the work. And the law, when it suited him, was just another weapon to keep folks in line. Silas didn't move from the kitchen window, though he felt every muscle in his shoulders tense. Mercy came out of the pantry just then, holding a sack of flour that looked too heavy for her frame. She caught sight of where his gaze had fixed, and the color drained from her cheeks. She didn't ask who it was. She didn't need to. The hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off the barn wall until they filled the yard. Briggs reined up near the cabin behind the main house, Mercy's cabin, swinging down from the saddle with a swagger that was meant to be noticed. He tied his horse to the post Silas had sunk into the ground for guests, though this visit felt anything but welcome. From where he stood, Silas could see the deputy glance around the yard, his eyes sliding over the barn, the corral, the house, checking if anyone was watching. Then he rapped on Mercy's door with the back of his hand. Not a polite knock, 3 sharp blows that carried across the distance like the crack of a whip. Mercy flinched. Her hands tightened on the sack of flour until her knuckles went white. "You expecting company?" Silas asked. She shook her head quickly, setting the flour down on the table as if it might shield her. "No, sir." The cabin door opened almost immediately, as if she'd been waiting for it. Briggs stepped inside without invitation, his shoulders filling the frame. Mercy stepped back, posture shrinking. Then the door shut, leaving the yard empty except for the deputy's horse and the low whistle of the wind. Silas's hand went to the back of a chair and stayed there, gripping the worn wood until his fingers ached. Every instinct screamed at him to cross the yard, kick that door in, and drag Briggs out by the collar. But he didn't. Not yet. He'd learned something from years of running a ranch. You don't fix a busted fence by hammering boards without first walking the whole line. You had to know where the real break was. So he waited. And while he waited, he noticed things. The way the curtain in Mercy's cabin shifted once, then stayed still. The way the horse pawed at the frozen ground like it wanted to be anywhere else. 20 minutes crawled by. When the door opened again, Briggs emerged first, adjusting his gun belt with the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd taken what he came for. Mercy stood in the doorway behind him, holding herself stiff, one hand braced against the frame. Even from here, Silas could see her wincing. Briggs swung into the saddle and rode toward town, whistling a tune that didn't belong in the morning air. Mercy watched him go. Her face paled and tight, then stepped back inside and shut the door. Silas didn't move until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the hills. Only then did he leave the house, crossing the yard with slow, measured steps. He didn't go to the cabin, not yet. Instead, he circled around the barn, keeping his eyes on the dirt. That's when he saw it. A scuff in the frost near the corner of the cabin, another by the woodpile, and near the stoop, the faint smear of blood on the frozen ground. His jaw tightened. It wasn't from any accident. Back in the kitchen, he poured himself coffee he didn't want and drank it, standing by the window. The coffee was bitter, but it kept his hands busy. His eyes kept drifting to the cabin door. When Mercy came to the main house again, she moved carefully, like someone trying to keep every joint and muscle in place. She had her hair pulled forward, hiding part of her face, but not enough to cover the swelling along her jawline. She kept her gaze low, her voice soft. "I'll start supper early. You'll want it hot if the weather turns." Silas studied her. "Mercy." She froze, then forced a small smile. "Yes, sir. You been having visitors I don't know about?" Her fingers twisted the edge of her apron. "No, sir." "You sure?" The smile faltered. I just keep to myself." The lie was so thin it might as well have been glass. Silas set his cup down and stepped closer, lowering his voice. "If someone's been bothering you, I need to know." Her eyes darted toward the window, then back to the floor. "It's nothing." The edge in his voice softened. "Mercy, that's not nothing. You've been limping for days. Now you've got bruises on your face. I'm no fool." She drew in a sharp breath, as if she'd been holding it all morning. But instead of answering, she turned toward the stove, fussing with the kettle. "I should get back to work." The conversation was over, or at least she wanted it to be. Silas let her go. For now. But as she left the house, he made himself a promise. Tomorrow, before the sun came up, he'd be waiting by that cabin door, and if Deputy Vernon Briggs came calling again, he'd see exactly what kind of welcome was waiting for him. Outside, the wind had shifted again, carrying the smell of snow. It was going to be a long night. Snow threatened in the air the next morning, the sky low and gray, pressing down on the valley like a wool blanket. Silas Ward stood in the shadow of the barn, tools in hand, pretending to work on a broken harness. His eyes weren't on the leather in front of him. They were fixed on the narrow track from town that wound through the cottonwoods and into his yard. He'd been there since first light, waiting. Mercy hadn't come to the main house yet. The stove smoke from her cabin curled thin and pale, proof she was inside, keeping to herself. He wondered if she thought the worst of it had passed, if she believed last night's visit from Briggs was over and done. Silas knew better. It was mid-morning when the sound reached him, the steady, deliberate rhythm of a single horse. No hurry, no drag, the sound of a man who wanted to be noticed. Briggs rode into the yard like he owned it, his shoulders loose, his chin tipped high. The wind caught on the brass of his badge, sending a faint flash of light across the barn wall. Silas kept his head down, knife scraping leather. Briggs tied his horse to the post outside Mercy's cabin. He didn't look toward the barn, didn't look toward the main house. His eyes were for the door in front of him. 3 knocks, the same as before. The door opened. Mercy's figure filled the frame. Even from here, Silas could see her posture, not welcoming, but resigned. She stepped aside without a word, and Briggs brushed past her, vanishing inside. Silas's grip tightened on the knife. He'd told himself he wouldn't go charging in, that barging through the door would give Briggs a reason to twist the law to his advantage. But the minutes ticked by, each one longer than the last, and the frost on the barn roof began to melt under the thin winter sun. 15 minutes, then 20. When the door opened again, Briggs was the first out, the smirk on his face a sharp contrast to the raw wind cutting through the yard. He adjusted his gun belt like a man checking the weight of his own authority. Mercy followed, one hand gripping the door frame. Her hair had slipped from its pins, falling in uneven strands across her cheek. She shifted her weight as though even the act of standing cost her. Briggs mounted his horse, the saddle creaking under his weight. He didn't look back, didn't nod, just turned his horse toward town and clicked his tongue. The animal moved out at a trot, carrying him toward the ridge until he disappeared into the gray light. Mercy stepped back inside her cabin and shut the door. Silas let out the breath he'd been holding. He set the harness aside, every movement deliberate. If he went to her now, she'd deny it, pretend nothing had happened, and maybe, just maybe, she'd be right. Not about the truth, but about the danger in speaking it too soon. So he waited until midday. When he knocked on her cabin door, the pause before it opened told him she'd been debating whether to answer. Mercy stood there in the dim interior, a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. Her face was pale, but the bruise along her jaw had darkened. "Mr. Ward," she said, her voice polite and distant. "Did you need something?" He stepped inside without asking. The air smelled faintly of coffee and wood smoke, and something else, something metallic. "I need to know," he said, shutting the door behind him. Her eyes dropped to the floor. "Know what?" "Briggs. How long's he been coming here?" Her shoulders tensed. "You don't." "I do," Silas cut in, his voice low but steady. "I saw him yesterday. I saw you after he left." Her hand tightened on the edge of the shawl. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the ticking of the small clock on her shelf. Finally, she let out a breath that trembled on the way out. "He says, I belong to him." The words were barely above a whisper. Silas felt something cold settle in his chest. "And do you?" She shook her head quickly. "I told him no. The first day I met him, I told him no. But he don't take no. Not from someone like me." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I came here with nothing. No family, no friends, no money. Folks believe what they're told, and he told them I was under his protection. That means anyone who'd hire me won't. Anyone who'd help me won't. And if I fight, he says." Her voice cracked, and she bit it back. He says he'll make sure I disappear, that there's places in these mountains where nobody ever finds you." Silas didn't speak right away. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the window, carrying the faint scent of snow. "When's he coming back?" he asked. Her eyes flickered toward the door. "He doesn't tell me, just shows up." Silas nodded once. "Then we'll be ready for him." She blinked. "Mr. Ward." He was already at the door. "Get some rest, Mercy." When he stepped back into the cold, the snow had started falling, thin flakes twisting in the wind. He crossed the yard to the barn, shutting the door behind him and leaning against the wall for a long moment. The quiet inside was thick, broken only by the soft shuffle of a horse in its stall. He knew Briggs wouldn't stop on his own. Men like him never did. And if the law wouldn't deal with him, then it was up to Silas Ward. The snow came hard in the night, blanketing the valley in white silence. By dawn the world looked clean and still, but Silas Ward knew better. Some things couldn't be covered over. He found Mercy in the main house kitchen, her hands wrapped around the coffee pot, like it was the only warm thing she had left in her. She was moving slower than he'd ever seen, every step measured, her body braced against itself as though even the air might hurt. The fresh bruises on her neck weren't from any fall. Silas set his hat on the peg by the door. "Mercy," he said, his voice low but firm. She glanced up, startled, as if she'd been expecting someone else. "Morning, Mr. Ward. Coffee?" He stepped closer, letting the floorboards creak under his boots. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." Her hands tightened on the pot. "Sir." "Briggs," he said, the name hitting the air like a thrown iron. "He's been coming here, hasn't he?" For a moment she didn't move. The only sound was the quiet tick of the mantel clock and the faint hiss from the stove. Then slowly, she set the coffee pot down. Her fingers trembled. "I don't know what you mean." "I saw him," Silas said. "I saw him go into your cabin, and I saw you after he left." Her composure cracked like ice on a warming pond. She turned away, bracing herself against the counter. Her shoulders began to shake, and when she finally looked at him, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "He's a deputy. Who's going to believe me over him? Who's going to care what happens to someone like me?" Silas didn't answer right away. He'd learned there were moments in a conversation when words could do more harm than silence. So he let her talk, and she did, the words spilling out like water from a split barrel, too fast to stop. She told him about arriving in town 3 months ago, running from troubles back east she wouldn't name, about finding no work until Silas had hired her, about the first day Briggs noticed her, cornering her behind the general store with a smile that never reached his eyes. "He said I was pretty," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Said a girl like me needed protection. I told him I didn't. That's when he said I didn't understand how things worked here, that I was his now, whether I liked it or not." Silas's jaw tightened. Mercy's voice grew smaller. He started showing up, at the store, outside the boarding house. When I moved to the cabin, I thought maybe it'd stop, but it didn't. He made sure everyone knew I was under his protection. Folks stopped talking to me, stopped looking at me. No one would hire me. No one would help me. I couldn't even get credit at the store. Her fingers gripped the edge of the counter. "He told me if I ever said a word, he'd make sure I disappeared. Said there were mines in the mountains where no one would ever find me. And he said he's done it before." The last part was barely a whisper. Silas stood very still. He'd known Vernon Briggs was mean, a petty tyrant with a badge. But this was different. This was evil, pure, and simple. "Why didn't you leave?" he asked quietly. Mercy gave a short, humorless laugh. "With what money? Where would I go? He's got friends in every town in the territory. He made sure I had nowhere else to turn." Silas stepped closer, his voice steady. "You have me." Her eyes flicked to his face, wide with fear. "Mr. Ward, you can't." "I can," he said, "and I will. He's not going to hurt you anymore." She shook her head, tears tracking down her cheeks. "If you stand up to him, he'll kill you. Or worse, he'll get the sheriff to put you in a cell for something you didn't do. These men, they protect each other." Silas's mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "There's something you should know about me, Mercy. I've never been much for talking, but I've always been real good at making sure the right thing gets done." He reached for his coat, pulling it from the peg. The morning light through the kitchen window caught the frost in his beard, turning it to silver. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Town," he said simply. Time Briggs learned he's not the only one who can make folks afraid. Her hands twisted in her apron. "Please." But he was already at the door. "Lock this behind me," he told her, and stepped out into the gray morning. The snow crunched under his boots as he crossed the yard to the barn. His horse, a sturdy roan named Jasper, snorted a cloud of steam into the air. Silas saddled him with slow, deliberate movements. He had a plan now, or enough of one to get started, and in the quiet between the barn walls, he let himself feel the thing he'd been holding back since yesterday: rage. Not the wild, aimless kind that burned out quick, but the cold, steady kind that stayed in a man's bones until the job was done. When he swung into the saddle and turned Jasper toward the road, the snow had begun to fall harder. The wind was in his face, but he didn't pull up his collar. Let the cold bite. Let it keep him sharp. An hour to town. Enough time to decide exactly how he wanted to start this. And he meant to start it in a way Vernon Briggs wouldn't forget. The town of Cedar Falls sat in a bowl between two low hills, its main street lined with weathered buildings that leaned slightly from years of wind. The place looked quiet from a distance, but Silas Ward knew better. Even in winter, folks had a way of showing up when trouble was brewing, and this morning, trouble was exactly what he'd brought with him. He rode Jasper straight down the middle of the street, not rushing, not hiding. He wasn't here to sneak. The snow crunched under the horse's hooves, muffling the sound of shutters creaking open as faces appeared in the windows. A few people stepped outside, squinting into the pale light. They knew Silas Ward. He came to town only when it mattered, and when it mattered, folks paid attention. He found Briggs exactly where he expected him, leaning against the post outside the saloon, badge catching the weak sunlight, a hand wrapped around a steaming tin cup. His voice carried in the cold air, telling some half-drunken story to the men beside him about a rancher he'd run out of town the week before. Silas dismounted without a word, looping Jasper's reins over the hitching post. The noise of the street faded in his ears. All he heard was the creak of wood under his boots and the low hum of his own breath. Briggs spotted him halfway across the street. His smirk faltered for a heartbeat, then returned, wider than before. Well, Briggs said, his voice pitched loud enough for the gathering crowd. "If it ain't the hermit rancher, finally decided to be sociable." Silas stopped 10 feet away, boots planted square. I came to talk to you about Mercy Whitmore." The name landed like a stone in still water. The men beside Briggs glanced at each other. The people on the boardwalk shifted, their boots scuffing against the planks. Briggs's face went through surprise, then calculation, before settling on a slow, ugly smile. "Don't know who you're talking about." "I think you do," Silas said, taking a step closer. "I think you know her real well." The crowd thickened. Farmers, shopkeepers, wives with children peeking from behind skirts. Eyes watched from saloon windows and the mercantile porch. Silas welcomed it. He wanted witnesses. Briggs straightened, letting his coat fall open so the badge gleamed. "You got something to say to me, Ward. Best say it plain." "I'm saying you've been hurting a woman who works for me," Silas said, his voice carrying clear and even. "I'm saying you're a coward who uses his badge to prey on people who can't fight back." A sharp silence dropped over the street. Even the wind seemed to pause. Horses stamped uneasily at their hitching posts. Briggs's jaw worked. "That's a serious accusation. You got proof of these lies?" Silas reached into his vest and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was blank, but Briggs didn't know that. "I do, actually." He unfolded it slowly, deliberately. "See, the thing about secrets is they have a way of coming to light when you least expect it." Briggs's eyes locked on the paper. His hand twitched toward his gun. Silas watched it happen like he'd been waiting for it all morning. The pistol came up quick, but Silas was already moving. 15 years of ranch work had made his reflexes sharp. He dove left as Briggs fired, the bullet whining past his ear and splintering the post behind him. The street exploded into chaos. People scattered. Horses reared. Briggs cocked his pistol for a second shot, but Silas came up fast, shoulder driving into the deputy's midsection. They slammed against the saloon wall hard enough to rattle the windows. The gun went off again, the shot going wild into the snow. Silas's hand closed over Briggs's wrist, twisting until the man cried out and the pistol clattered to the boardwalk. It skittered to a stop near the boots of Marshal Kane. Kane had come running at the sound of gunfire, his own revolver drawn but pointed at the ground. He was older than Briggs, with steady eyes and a face lined by years of making hard calls. "That's enough," Kane barked. "Both of you, step back." Silas let go, breathing hard. Briggs staggered against the wall, cradling his wrist, hatred burning in his eyes. "He attacked me," he snarled. "Tried to kill me. Arrest him." Kane didn't move right away. His gaze swept over the crowd. That true? This man attacked Briggs without cause. The silence was heavy. Then Mrs. Henderson, the widow who ran the boarding house, stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "Marshal, there's things you need to know about your deputy." "Don't listen to her," Briggs snapped. "She's crazy." But more voices joined in. The blacksmith spoke of Briggs threatening his daughter. A merchant told of money gone missing after Briggs searched his shop. Story after story spilled into the cold air, each one painting a picture that stripped the shine from the badge on Briggs's chest. Kane's face darkened with every word. When the last voice faded, Silas reached into his coat again and pulled out a torn scrap of fabric. "Found this near Mercy Whitmore's cabin," he said, holding it up so everyone could see. The pattern matched the shirt Briggs was wearing. Kane looked at the cloth, then at Briggs's shirt, then back to Silas. His voice was flat when he spoke. "Vernon Briggs, you're under arrest." The color drained from Briggs's face. "You can't." "Badge," Kane said, holding out his hand. For a moment, It looked like Briggs might reach for his gun instead. Then the fight drained out of him, leaving only a twitching scowl. He unclipped the badge and slapped it into Kane's palm. Kane turned to the crowd. "Anyone willing to make a statement, come to my office this afternoon. We're going to get this on record." Silas stepped back, his breath curling in the cold air. The crowd began to break apart, voices low but urgent. Briggs stood between two deputies now, his wrists in irons. For the first time in months, Silas saw something new in the faces of the townsfolk. Not fear, but relief. He hadn't planned for what came next. But as Kane led Briggs away, Silas knew the fight wasn't over. Not until Mercy could stand in the middle of this town without looking over her shoulder. The street hadn't finished settling when Briggs made his move. 1 second he was between the two deputies, hands in irons. The next, he twisted hard, slamming his shoulder into the man on his left. The younger deputy stumbled, grip loosening just enough for Briggs to wrench himself free. In the same breath, Briggs lunged toward the boardwalk, boot striking something metallic, his fallen revolver still lying where it had skittered earlier. "Gun!" someone shouted. The crowd scattered again, the air erupting into the ragged scrape of boots on frozen planks. Briggs snatched the pistol and swung it up, his eyes locked on Silas. "You just signed your death warrant." Silas dove sideways, snow spraying as the first shot cracked past him. The slug hit the saloon's corner post, sending splinters into the air. He rolled and came up on one knee, hands empty, but his gaze never leaving Briggs's gun. Marshal Kane was moving fast, but not fast enough. The two remaining deputies drew down on Briggs, their own weapons steady. But the deputy's wild eyes made him unpredictable. "Drop it, Vernon," Kane barked. Briggs laughed, the sound high and sharp. "You think you can take me down on the word of a bunch of dirt farmers and a half-mad widow?" "You've heard enough from him," Silas called to Kane, his voice steady despite the adrenaline hammering in his veins. And then Briggs made his mistake. He pivoted toward Mrs. Henderson, the woman who'd been the first to speak up, his arm extending in a smooth, practiced motion. Silas didn't think. He lunged forward, closing the distance in 3 long strides. His shoulder hit Briggs square in the ribs, driving them both into the snow. The gun went off again, deafening at such close range, the round biting into the dirt inches from Mrs. Henderson's boots. The pistol clattered free. Kane was on them in an instant, boot planting on the weapon as the deputies wrenched Briggs's arms behind him. This time, the irons stayed on. Kane hauled him upright, his face set in stone. "You're done, Vernon. Every word, every story, every piece of proof. It's all coming with us." The townsfolk had gathered again, drawn by the noise, and now they weren't just watching. They were speaking. The blacksmith stepped forward, voice low but clear. "Last spring, he came to my shop after hours, said my daughter owed him for walking home alone after church. I told him to leave. He said if I made trouble, she'd disappear. We left town for a month." A young ranch hand spoke up next. "Caught him in my barn, going through my tack. Said he was checking for stolen goods. A week later, a new saddle just like mine turned up in his brother's store." Voices overlapped, each adding to the ledger of Briggs's cruelty. A shopkeeper who'd lost half his till after a routine inspection. A freighter who'd been fined for imaginary violations until he couldn't afford to leave. A widow who'd been protected right out of her own property. Every story was another nail in Briggs's coffin. Kane listened without interrupting, his weathered face growing darker with each account. Finally, He turned to Silas. "You got anything to add?" Silas reached into his coat and pulled out the torn scrap of fabric again. "Found this near Mercy Whitmore's cabin yesterday. Matches his shirt." Kane held the scrap up to Briggs's shoulder. The tier and pattern were a perfect match. "That's enough for me," Kane said. Briggs's bravado cracked for the first time. "You can't prove a thing in court. They'll never." "They will." Kane cut him off. "You've had your thumb on this town for too long. Time folks remembered what the law's supposed to look like." He nodded to the deputies. "Get him to the jail and post a guard, one who doesn't owe him a damn thing." As they led Briggs away, the crowd began to murmur, not in fear, but in something closer to relief. Shoulders eased. People straightened. Mrs. Henderson stepped to Silas's side. "Thank you," she said softly. He shook his head. "Don't thank me yet. It's not over." Kane turned back to Silas. "Tomorrow I'll need you to bring Miss Whitmore to town. She'll need to give her statement." "She'll be here," Silas said. Kane hesitated, then added quietly, "I should have seen it. Should have stopped it sooner." Silas met his gaze. "We all should have. But it's stopped now." The snow had thickened into a steady fall, muting the sound of the town. Silas looked down the street toward the ridge. He pictured Mercy standing in her cabin doorway, one hand braced on the frame, watching for a shadow she couldn't shake. Maybe tonight would be the first she could sleep without flinching at every sound. But first, he had to ride home and tell her the truth. And the truth, he thought, was the only thing worth carrying through a storm. By the time Silas left Cedar Falls, the snow had softened into a steady drift that blurred the edges of the world. Jasper's hooves crunched through it in a slow, even rhythm, each step carrying them farther from the echo of boots, voices, and the slam of the jailhouse door. Vernon Briggs was behind bars. For the first time in weeks, Silas let his shoulders drop beneath the weight of that fact. But it wasn't the kind of relief that made a man smile. It was the heavy, sober kind. The kind that came when you knew something was finished, but the damage it left behind would take longer to mend. The ride home felt different. The cottonwoods lining the road swayed gently under their coats of snow, and the hills seemed quieter than usual. No wind, no sound but the creak of leather and the measured breath of his horse. He thought about what Marshal Kane had said, that Mercy would need to come into town tomorrow to make her statement. He knew she wouldn't want to, not after everything, but he also knew she'd go, not because she trusted the law, but because she understood what happened when no one spoke. The ranch came into view just as the gray sky began to dim toward evening. Smoke curled from the chimney of Mercy's cabin, the thin ribbon of it twisting in the still air. She was sitting on the porch steps when he rode into the yard, shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. She stood when she saw him, but didn't step forward. Silas swung down from Jasper and looped the reins over the hitching post. He walked toward her slowly, boots sinking into the snow. "It's done," he said when he reached the porch. Her eyes searched his face. "Done?" "Briggs is in jail. Kane's got him locked up tight. He's not getting out, and he's not coming back here." For a moment Mercy just stared. Then her knees buckled, and she sat hard on the porch step. She pressed her hands to her face, but not fast enough to hide the tears. They weren't the silent, shamed tears he'd seen before. These were different, unsteady, gasping, the kind that came when the thing you'd feared for so long was finally over, and your body didn't know how to let go. "I thought She stopped to catch her breath. I thought he'd always be there, waiting. You thought wrong, Silas said gently. She lowered her hands, her cheeks flushed from the cold and from crying. How? Folks in town had a lot to say once someone said it first, he told her. Kane listened, and I made sure there was proof he couldn't ignore. Mercy gave a short, shaky laugh. I didn't think anyone would believe me. Sometimes it just takes one person willing to stand up, he said. They sat in silence for a while, the snow settling around them, soft and steady. Out in the pasture, the cattle stood near the fence line, their breath fogging in the cold. The world felt different, not just because Briggs was gone, but because the shadow he'd cast no longer reached this far. What happens now? She asked at last. Now, Silas said. You heal. You remember what it feels like to be safe. And tomorrow, you ride into town with me and tell Kane your story. Her eyes narrowed slightly. You sure that's safe? He nodded. He's not walking out of that cell. And once your statement's on record, it won't just be his word against yours. Mercy glanced toward the horizon, where the hills were fading into dusk. I don't know if I'm ready. You don't have to be ready, he said. You just have to be willing. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the smell of wood smoke from the main house. Silas stood and offered her his hand. After a pause, she took it, letting him pull her to her feet. Come on, he said. It's too cold to be sitting out here. They walked toward the cabin door. At the threshold, she stopped, her gaze catching on something in the yard. Jasper standing still, his ears pricked toward the road. You think it's over? She said quietly. I know it is, he replied. But as he looked out over the snowy valley, he understood the truth of what she meant. Men like Briggs didn't happen alone. There'd always be others who thought a badge or a gun gave them the right to take what they wanted. It wasn't over for good. It never was. But for Mercy, here and now, it was over enough. Inside, the small cabin was warm. The fire in the stove crackled softly, and the light from it touched the walls in flickering gold. Silas poured her a cup of coffee, setting it on the table before taking a chair across from her. She wrapped her hands around the mug, staring into the steam. Why'd you do it, Mr. Ward? Because it was the right thing, he said. Her eyes met his. That's not reason enough for most men. Then most men have forgotten what matters. They stayed there until the coffee was gone, until the snow outside had piled against the cabin step. And when Silas stood to leave, Mercy surprised him. You said there's always work for someone willing to do it honestly. That's still true? It is, he said. Then I'll stay, she told him, if you'll have me. He didn't smile, not much anyway, but there was a warmth in his voice when he said, I'll have you. When he stepped back out into the night, the sky was clear. The stars sharp as glass. The air was cold enough to bite, but for the first time in months, the ranch felt still in a good way. Somewhere inside the main house, the mantel clock ticked steady and calm. Out in the pasture, the cattle shifted in the snow, content. And in the small cabin behind the house, a young woman was sitting in the firelight, safe for the first time in a long while. Silas knew that wouldn't fix everything, but it was a start. The storm broke in the night, leaving the valley washed in silver light. By morning, the snow was hard-crusted under a clear sky, and smoke rose from 2 chimneys instead of 1. Life on the ranch had a way of moving forward, even after shadows were driven out. Silas rode the fence line that day. the cold, clean air in his lungs, and thought about the choice he'd made. It would have been easier to look the other way, to keep to his work, and let someone else bear the weight. But in a place like this, someone else never came. Mercy was in the yard when he returned, hanging laundry in the brittle sunshine. She looked up when she heard his horse, and in her expression there was no fear, only the steady calm of someone who knew she was no longer alone. Justice here was never perfect, and peace was never permanent. But sometimes a man could plant something solid in the ground, a stand taken, a wrong set right, and know it might hold even after he was gone.